Okay, that's not good.
No, it's all right. It's just a wee bit slow. Right, I'm going to give a brief summary of 10 years of developer-funded archaeology on the Isle of Iona. So this is quite different from a lot of the research-based stuff you've heard about so far. This is all in, basically when somebody has a planning application, the council maybe put an archaeological condition on the planning application, and I'll go in and deal with the archaeology before they're allowed to build their extension or whatever. So this is what I've been doing on Iona. I'm going to roughly talk about the results roughly in chronological order. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the early prehistoric evidence, and I'm going to mention some sites on the island. So this site, Bishop's Walk up here in the north. This is the village on Iona, and this is the Abbey here. And I'm going to talk about the primary school site, which was an extension of the primary school. Village Hall is going to be done possibly this year, and did some work before they started work on the village hall in the field here, and then a little house development just here as well. So first to the Mesolithic period. Most of the evidence from the Mesolithic period on the island is in the form of lithics. Mostly these are in flint. We've got a few bits of worked quartz as well. Torbens did the analysis of most of the lithics from the work I've done on the island, and this is some of the assemblage we got from the primary school site, and he thinks this is mostly fairly early Neolithic material. Unfortunately, lots of the lithics are in secondary context, so they're not in a primary context. They're not in pits, they're not associated with any structure or anything. They're either in redeposited into soils or later features. But we're getting quite a lot of this lithic material from the primary school site, regardless of that. In terms of buried soils, we've got dating from the sort of the Mesolithic period. You can see this dark material here. This is actually the primary school site during the excavation. So you can see we've got a date of about 7,500 BC from that buried soil just there. And then I'm just going to show you a slide of this section here. And when they excavated down a wee bit more, there was possibly the same buried soil running through here. And we've got a radiocarbon date of 6,500 BC from there. Didn't get any lithic material surviving from this, but as I said, there was lots of lithic material in and around this site. I did some soil microbiological analysis on this soil, and it appears it's mostly it's really high organic material, and it's basically burnt grasses. And this soil developed on the raised beach deposits at this location, so it's the initial soil development on the island, and at some point has been subject to severe burning. And I'll talk about the other stuff above it later on, but there's a very sharp boundary here, sort of a period maybe of sediment hiatus. So there was a period when the surface was exposed before anything else happened on top here. This is in the field below to the south of the nunnery and to the east of the village hall on Iona, and you can see you've got the same dark black burnt soil, and this time it's developed over wind-blown sands at this location. And actually, I was getting quite a lot of lithics from this soil. Torben's not had a chance to look at it yet, but for my untrained eye, it looks kind of Mesolithic-ish. Then this is up at the Bishop's Walk sites. This is to the north of the Abbey. And here, this is quite different here. We've got these glacial gravels, we're at a higher level here, and there's no lithics in that material, but a huge amount of lithics in just the topsoil. This is now where there's some glamping pods. This is now in a sort of campsite. So they were just literally taking off the turf just to put their pod on the top, but got lots of what Torben thinks is later Mesolithic material from the topsoil, really. And I think probably he had lots of, quite a few of the lithics were water rolled. suggests that they've been subject to erosion by the sea at some point. So that was a bit confusing here because we're quite high up, and given the date of them, they probably couldn't have been waterlogged at this location. So what I think's happened is, this is the site's up here. This is the 10-metre contour coming down. Now, after the last glaciation, when the ice melted, the sea level rose quite dramatically and was probably at its highest in the Neolithic period at about 8 to 10 metres. And that was before the land sort of recovered and sort of bounced back up, and then sea levels then reduced. So you can see we're well above the area where they could have been affected by this sort of marine transgression. So what I think's probably happened is that the folk up at Bishop's Walk, when it was a croft, have been stripping topsoil from elsewhere on the island and bringing it up to the croft to make their soils thicker, better soils. We don't know where they got that from, but presumably if they'd be like me, the least work you can do, the better. So presumably as locally as possible. And it could be that they actually were stripping turf off the shore down here and taking up to the croft. So it gives the potential that there are potentially Mesolithic sites, be they damaged or not, by coastal erosion along the shore at Iona. This is this small site just near the village hall, Darrochbeag, and you can see again we're getting the same buried soil, the dark soil here, again just developing on the wind-blown sands. Got quite a lot of lithic material, most of it undiagnostic from here, but one flint that Torben thinks may be sort of more characteristic of the Neolithic. So it's showing that this buried soil maybe has quite a long history. And then we're coming on slightly later, well, more modern period. So this is Bronze Age, and this is the primary school site. Again, this is a soakaway they were putting in, and you can see we're getting ard marks surviving. This is a plan of that trench there. And then this was the big trench they dug for the new sewer chamber at the primary school. And again, we're getting some argot surviving and possibly little small negative features. Getting dates from the soil, very varied, but basically sort of spanning the whole of the Bronze Age. And you can see that this orange overlying the ard marks is basically this sort of Bronze Age buried soil. And when I did the thin section analysis, certainly the orange sort of colluvial-like soil above it, it looked like it had a midden-like material added to it to make it more fertile. So there's good evidence on the island for this Bronze Age cultivation. And I know Glasgow University, when they did their work up near the Abbey, they got ard marks as well in one of their trenches, again, which they thought was prehistoric cultivation. So to summarise the, sort of the prehistoric stuff, the Mesolithic evidence is limited just to lithics at the moment. So we have no evidence of the settlements, and the same for the Bronze Age. We've got evidence of cultivation, but we don't really have the settlement evidence. As I said, the marine transgression peaking in the Neolithic times when sea levels between 8 to 10 metres high today, so it may have also destroyed some of these Mesolithic sites. Right, now I'm going to talk about possible early medieval and medieval activity that we found on the island. So just again, to put primary school, talk about a little site called Oran Cottage and a site called Blockhouse here, just as you come off the ferry. So this is the primary school site. So this is north at this end, and this is where the primary school actually is currently. Now this is their new extension. And basically, you've got a turf wall coming along here, we've got this ditch, and then we've got this revetment wall. And we started machining out just to see if there was something here, and started hitting some archaeology. So finished hand digging this section here, and then these ones were hand dug. And they actually changed the design a bit of the extension, so they didn't have to dig down into the archaeology. So vast majority of this is still surviving under the extension. This is the turf wall or bank as it is. Basically it's constructed from turf with some stone footing at the base, and it sits over, this is this early buried soil here. And this is orientated roughly north-south. This is it in section, so this is the lower buried soil, and this is probably the Bronze Age soil. And you can see here we've got a ditch coming down here. Unfortunately, I don't know the relationship between that ditch and the turf bank, but they seem to lie parallel to each other, so it's possible that they're contemporary. Got some charcoal from the lower bit of the ditch. It flooded, so unfortunately couldn't get to the base of it, which dates to 8th to 9th century. Obviously, you've got all the sort of caveats with dating ditches using charcoal. And then you can see you've got a upper ditch cut coming along here, and it appears to cut that turf bank, so this one presumably is later than the turf bank. So this is the this upper ditch in here with this revetment wall built into the ditch. So this is it under excavation. We've got quite a lot of tumble here. I'm not sure whether this is rebuilding of the wall when it fell down, or whether it's some kind of, I don't know, some kind of entrance or something through. I don't know, it's a bit strange. You can see it here. So this is us bottomed out in the ditch. This is the base of the ditch. There's the stone revetment wall. This is that buried soil again, that really early buried soil, and this is the turf wall running along here, and there's a bit of collapse left in there. And this would be the revetment wall here, and we're getting 9th century charcoal from the fill against the revetment wall, and we're getting 13th century charcoal from the top, plus some transitional pottery as well, which we'll talk about in a bit later on. So basically we've got this, what appears to be two ditches, one on top of the other, and a turf bank running north-south direction at the primary school site, and it's trying to work out what it relates to. It's looking like it may be sort of early medieval in date. This is the Abbey, and this is the line of the vallum coming round with other banks and ditches. So this is the St Columba's monastic vallum coming round, so the boundary around the monastery, the early medieval monastery on Iona. And this was a geophysics done for the National Trust by Rose Consultancy. And you can see here that in green is actual natural geology. Our site's just down here, but it's just to see trying to think whether the ditch and revetment wall I have down here in the primary school site, whether that does relate to any of this material up here. Quite a few years ago, when they were part of Bradford Uni, Susan also did geophysics around the nunnery. And so the primary school site's actually literally just here, so it's very, very close. And when I first saw this, I was quite a bit excited because I thought, well, this is a ditch, maybe it relates to the one we've got. But Susan redid the analysis for me of this data, and she thinks actually this is fairly modern disturbance, and thinks it's very unlikely it's going to be a ditch, and she thinks this is actually natural coming through here. So I'm not having much success. Again, for the National Trust for Scotland, Rose Geophysics did this work. So this is the village halls. The primary school site's just here, nunnery's just in here, and you can see that's a line of natural coming through that probably we saw in that nunnery geophysics. Interestingly, this corresponds to the old Neolithic shoreline as well. So tend to when we did a septic tank work in here, we didn't find any archaeology at all, and then it was below that old shoreline. You can see there's no evidence on this geophysics for any ditches at all, so we're not having much success. Estate map from late 18th century. The primary school site sits here, so it sits on the line of this road that's shown on the estate map. So that's quite interesting that whatever the boundary that we found in the primary school site is clearly, that line is clearly still being respected and maintained in the 18th century. So this is the, just orientate myself, yeah, it's a nunnery. So that's the primary school site there that we developed. And you can see before we started work, there's still a modern boundary now following that same line along here. So really, in conclusion to this ditch and these two ditches and this revetment wall, it possibly is early medieval in date, and then sort of with later rebuilding. But I think a lot more work needs to be done in and around this area to see if we can actually get some better dating evidence for it and see where it extends to. The village hall is meant to be getting demolished and rebuilt, so I'm hoping that we might pick it up in the village hall. Oran Cottage, which is actually down in the lower part of the village, we've got this mass of sort of alluvial soils. At the bottom, we're getting quite a lot of stone tools in them, some lithics, and then lots of pottery as well. We've got a 10th century date for some burnt material at the base here, but it's really jumbled mix-up soils that are coming off the hill. There even seems to be possibly some sort of revetment going on there to try and stop some of this downslope erosion of the soils. Now to Block House. Here is a tiny little extension, but we've got two buried middens, again, which have been dumped on windblown sands. And basically, there was quite interesting. This site lies just below the nunnery, so whether this midden relates to the sort of last sort of vestiges of use of the nunnery and is their waste in the nunnery, I don't know. But we looked at the bones and the fish bones, and we could see that their analysis shows that it was mostly cattle in there, obviously being butchered, getting somewhat use of wild animals as well. And also, interestingly, slight difference in the fishing techniques used from the lower midden and the upper midden. So later on, they're starting to use drift nets. And then we've got the usual carbonised barley and oats as well. So sticking to the late 15th century, this is really nice chlorate schist crosshead that we found on the primary school site. It was a bit of a shock, really. We were just in the turf, and the machine hit a big stone and turned it over, and there it was. And because it was in the turf, it was literally, a few centimetres below the grass. I think, and given its condition, I think maybe it had been stored in a house by somebody and maybe just sort of discarded in the last, 50, 100 years or so. So it's a bit odd where we found it, really. David's done did the specialist report for me, so if you've got any questions for David later on about the cross, please ask him. But basically, it's low relief carving, and you've got these strands, and they've got three sort of leaves each, and they're all intertwined. There's a possible representation of what you'd have got on metalworking, like a little knob, like if you would have a metal rivet. So that's quite interesting on one part of it. And you can also see there's little incised lines for the actual leaves as well. The parallel is McKinnon's cross, which is also late 15th century, but David points out this is much more well carved cross, and he suggests that the one we have from the primary school site may have been done by a sort of inexperienced craftsperson. Right, so finally I'm going to talk about the pottery that we're getting. This is sort of applies to all of Argyll, really. We're getting lots of handmade pottery, but unfortunately in Argyll the use of local clays and the use of using coil potting, the technique didn't really change from the Bronze Age right up to the 17th and 18th century. So if you get a piece that's undecorated and you don't know what period or site is, it's almost impossible to use the pottery to give you a date, because it works, so they've just not changed the techniques of thousands of years. This is a piece from a dated context at Oran Cottage, 10th, 11th century. But this is stuff from Block House, from those dated middens, and you can see this is 15th, 16th century. But this stuff, wouldn't be out of place on an Iron Age site. But we are getting somewhere, starting to get somewhere with the pottery in terms of the decorated stuff. So this is a piece of pot that's got stabware that was excavated during Thomas's excavations around the Abbey. And you can see they've got this stabware decoration on pottery from Oran Cottage. And this is possibly one pot, stabware stuff, pottery from a site on the Isle of Mull, which is obviously not so far away from Iona. And this has come from a nice sealed date, radiocarbon dated, one of these pieces came from, and it was 12th to mid-13th century. So that's quite nice. And we're getting very similar stuff we had when we excavated another chapel site on Mull, which is 13th century. And then also from Lismore, you're getting the same sort of stabbedware stuff as well. And again, probably 12th, 13th century in date. So we're sort of knowing now, where if we get this sort of stabware stuff, we know what sort of date we're looking at. So we're getting somewhere very slowly. This is the piece of transitional ware from the primary school site. Basically transitional ware because it's sort of halfway house between the really sort of crudely made grass tempered ware and Scottish red wares. And then we're also on Iona getting imported stuff from the mainland, and this was from a site, Bishop's House, which is just sort of southeast of the Abbey. And then this was from a pit, so you can see it's 17th century, 18th century date for this piece of imported wares, but in the same context you're actually getting material that again looks prehistoric in date, but clearly probably is 17th, 18th century. So a long way to go with our pottery. And then we even got a piece of French pottery from the primary school site as well, so that's rather nice, showing all the differences we can get. So basically, just to conclude then, Archaeological Iona does have archaeological richness outside the sort of the Abbey area and the monastic establishment. But certainly with developer funded stuff, it's very sort of small scale, especially on Iona with little extension things, so it's hard to build up a big picture. But we know the island was exploited in the early historic periods. So again, it's just a time really to find the actual settlement evidence. And I think there's great potential for buried soils here, and looking at early prehistoric farming practices, the soils do survive quite well on Iona. The ditch we got and the revetment wall, it may be early medieval in date, but we're not sure. But if it is, it may be part of Ewan's here again, so he'll maybe talk more about that. But it's maybe part of the monumentalisation of the monastery in the 8th sort of century, when pilgrimage became quite popular and there's a cult of the saint and that kind of thing happening. So it may be that part of that extension and expansion of the settlement. And then we are starting to work out a typology of handmade pottery on Iona, but again, it's something else that needs further work. Okay, thanks very much.